So I wanted to share a moment from one of our tours and a little snippet about a historical character from Bath's 18th century history who influenced the culinary scene and became somewhat of a local celebrity. And I always find it interesting how art seems to reflect so many other topics in so many ways, and the culinary history of Bath is no exception. This is a painting by J.M.W. Turner, the great impressionist of the late 18th century and early 19th century, and he painted this around about 1793 after he'd visited the city 2 years earlier. And the abbey is pretty recognisable in this image, but there are also some very unrecognisable buildings there which no longer exist. And Turner had actually, probably inadvertently, painted in properties which were connected to two other artists. Firstly, the one immediately to the right of the abbey, which almost looks like it's attached, was a milliner's shop owned by the sister of Thomas Gainsborough, and he actually had his studio in the same building. And he came to Bath to paint our portraits, and he said that painting in Bath was pickpocketing by portraiture, because it was a big social adventure in Bath in the 18th century to have your portraits painted, so he could charge us a fortune, which he actually didn't really need to do, because his wife was the illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Beaufort, who lived at Badminton just up the road, and he didn't want the fact that he'd had a child out of wedlock to be all the gossip, so he was paying her £200 a year to keep her quiet, and that Gainsboroughs could live quite handsomely off that, but it didn't stop Thomas Gainsborough from charging us a fortune to paint our portraits. But the property that we're concerned with really is the house on the left side of the abbey. That's also no longer there, but it includes a property which was owned by Charles Gill. And Gill had actually been apprenticed to the great Joshua Reynolds. We don't have any portraits of Gill himself, but there is a painting by him which hangs in the Tate Britain in London today. Unfortunately, Joshua Reynolds described Charles Gill's style as linear, naive, and showing no influence of his master. And when Joshua Reynolds says that about you, really your career as an artist is over. However, he came to Bath and he became rather more successful in the culinary industry. He became a baker, and in fact he was so successful that even Jane Austen described his raspberry tarts as the best in the world. But it was the lesser known writer Christopher Anstey who lived on the Royal Crescent and paid one of the best tributes to Charles Gill in his best known book, The New Bath Guide. And rather than being a tourist guide, as its title suggests, the book is actually a series of letters, prose, essays, poems, and songs written about the antics and adventures of a fictional family called the Blunderheads. But in the appendix, Anstey dedicates a whole song to Charles Gill, which goes on a bit, so I'll cut it short. He says, "Ye bards who sing the hero's praise, or lasses of the mill, a loftier theme invites your lays, come tune your lyres to Gill. Of all the cooks the world can boast, however great their skill, to bake or fry, to boil or roast, there's none like Master Gill." And jumping quickly to the end, "Your spirits and your blood to stir, old Galen gives a pill, but I the forced meat ball prefer prepared by Master Gill. While he so well can broil and bake, I'll promise and fulfil no other physic care to take than what's prescribed by Gill. Your bard has lived at Bath so long, he dreads to see your bill. Instead of cash, accept this song, my worthy Master Gill." I'm not sure if Mr. Gill ever did accept the song in payment for all the baked goods that Mr. Anstey took from him. But my favourite tale about Charles Gill concerns a report that was in a local newspaper at the time about a journey that Mr. Gill took alone to London in a post-chaise, which is a carriage where the driver sits outside and the occupant sits behind a large glass window. Now, Charles Gill, by all accounts, was a large man who could look after himself, but seems to have had a rather timid personality, so when he saw a highwayman charging towards his carriage, Mr. Gill feared for his life, and wanting to get the whole affair over with as quickly as possible, he pulled out his purse and reached it through the window to pass to the robber, not realising that the window was still raised, so unintentionally punched his hand through the glass in the process. The highwayman sees this happen from a distance and fears he's no match for Mr. Gill, so turns his horse on its hooves and scarpers. Meanwhile, Mr. Gill is so shocked by all of this that he spends the rest of the journey to London on the floor of the carriage so as not to be seen. Regardless of this, his contribution to the culinary industry as a food hero is unquestionable,